Noa nongoniwi and dai benopni asqua and da oldi bana and dakinok, deliwi tamen yo Schaghticoke. At the meeting of the Hudson and Hoosic rivers lies a place called Scatakoke. It's where our Dutch Indigenous Van Antwerp ancestors lived for nearly 2 centuries, before joining our Bowman, Dunham, Spear, Man lines from Quebec and Vermont in the uplands of Greenfield. Like Saratoga in the late 18th century, Scatakoke became something more than a geographic crossroads in the late 17th century. It became a refuge for native families displaced by war, colonial expansion, and political upheaval. Long before European colonization, the Hudson and Connecticut River valleys were home to interconnected Algonquian-speaking peoples. Mohican communities lived along the Hudson River. Wappinger groups occupied lands farther south, and to the north and east, Abenaki peoples maintained villages throughout what are now called Vermont, New Hampshire, and Maine. These communities were never isolated. They were connected through kinship, diplomacy, and seasonal travel routes that linked river valleys across the Northeast. The 17th century brought dramatic upheaval. Disease, land seizures, and colonial expansion placed increasing pressure on Indigenous communities. Then, in 1675, conflict erupted across New England in what became known as King Philip's War. Entire native towns were destroyed. Many survivors fled westward and northward, seeking refuge with relatives and allies. As the scholar Gordon Day noted, some of these displaced people became part of the emerging community at Scatakoke. Greylock is reported to have been active in King Philip's War. More probably, he was one of the refugees who fled after the war to the Hudson River region and were settled at Scatakoke during 1676 and 1677. The best historical scholarship indicates that Greylock appears to have originated among Eastern Algonquian-speaking Waranoke people of the Westfield River region in present-day western Massachusetts. These movements were not isolated. They were part of a broader pattern of regrouping as native families gathered in safer locations with long-standing kinship networks. In 1676, colonial authorities in New York encouraged displaced native families to gather at Scatakoke. Located along important river routes northeast of Albany, the settlement quickly became a meeting place for diverse indigenous communities. Rather than belonging to a single tribe, Scatakoke became a multi-tribal refuge community. Mohican, Wappinger, Mohawk allies, and Algonquian-speaking families connected to Abenaki communities gathered there. The community was not just a place of refuge, it was also a place of organization, diplomacy, and survival. Scatakoke remained connected to a wider indigenous world extending northward into Abenaki territory. Gordon Day describes how leaders such as Greylock continued to draw from these networks in the decades that followed. During Dummer's War, Greylock achieved renown for his daring raids. Albany officials frequently served as intermediaries, since New York maintained relations with the Schaghticokes, from whom Greylock had recruited much of his band. By the early 18th century, Greylock was associated with Missisquoi, yet his connections to Scatakoke remained clear. Day further notes that in 1723, Lieutenant Governor William Dummer attempted to conciliate Greylock through Colonel Johannes Schuyler of Albany. These diplomatic efforts show how Scatakoke stood at the center of communication between colonial governments and native leaders. That connection did not disappear, as Day records in 1726 to 1727. In January, the Albany authorities sent Greylock's brother, Malalamet, who was apparently still at Scatakoke, to invite the war chief to Albany to negotiate, but Malalamet reported that he had missed him. This account confirms that even decades after its founding, Scatakoke remained an active community tied directly to regional leadership, diplomacy, and kinship networks. In the years that followed, the Scatakoke community remained part of a larger indigenous landscape stretching across the Northeast. Over time, some families from Scatakoke moved north along river routes to nearby Greenfield, Corinth, Lake George, and Missisquoi, and into mission communities in Quebec. Others moved west in later generations, following broader patterns among Mohican and Munsee-related peoples into the Great Lakes region, including present-day New York, Ontario, and Michigan. Branches of our family followed similar paths, north toward Lake George and Saratoga, and west, like our third great-grandfather Daniel Van Antwerp, into the Great Lakes. These movements reflect the same networks of kinship and adaptation that had defined Scatakoke from the beginning. They helped reshape communities such as Missisquoi, Odanak, Wolanak, while ties to the Hudson Valley homeland continued through travel, memory, and family. Scatakoke was never simply a village. It was a place of refuge, a place of gathering, a place where displaced nations rebuilt their lives. At the meeting of the rivers, communities came together, and the enduring story of Native survival in the Northeast continued. Asqua indaol dibana, Yodali, Indakinok.